Hello, YouTube. This is Doug Robbins. I want to talk to you today about filmmaking, but first I want to start off with a quote. An English professor of mine a few semesters back told me he was talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. And he said, the characters, or you think you're all safe and you're in a nice little high school world, and then that's interrupted. You're shaken to the core, your world's rocked, and that kind of got me thinking about how all movies have an interruptant, something that interrupts the lives of the main character. Creates conflict, an obstacle that they should overcome, blah, blah, blah. And I would say the most intrusive and the best example of an interruptive has got to be horror. To me, horror is something, why I choose to write it, both screenplay and fiction, is number one, I find it the most thrilling, and number two, it's the easiest to write in a way when you think of the interruptant, because you can have stories started, you have enough subplot, like for example Black Christmas. Sorority sisters on Christmas Eve are stalked by a serial killer, and they're hunted down one by one, and you think, well, I love the Christmas idea, but let's say you're going to do what you said, serial killer crap, get out of here, we don't want that, but we kind of like the relationships we've made. What's one of the subplots we could grab and kind of make another movie with? And that, to me, would be the subplot with the girl Claire. That now she's headed home for the holidays. Her dad's there to pick her up. And Olivia Hussey tells Barbara Margaret Kidder's character that she has enough trouble fitting in without you making it worse. And you think you could make an entire film off of that premise, the relationship of the girls. I mean, there was a nice dynamic. One point, I don't know her name, but she also played in the remake of Black Christmas. I'm always looking for emotion in my pieces. When I write screenplays, when I write short stories, books, whatever. Because I don't feel like enough people give enough stories sentiment or real emotion. She's crying over, or she's hugging and holding on to Olivia Hussey's character, and real genuine friendship. She's like, I have a bad feeling she's dead, and of course Olivia's like, no, don't say that. Da 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 da. Real genuine emotion. It's really sweet, and it's like the potential's there, and the interruptant for horror, because horror is a weird genre, because to tell the best story, to get the most out of your story, what I believe you have to do is write a story that, with an interruptant, the bad guy should be bad. Okay? You should totally hate the guy. You should not root for him. But at the same time, you think the bad guy's the motherfucker we're going to have to put up with till the end. The ones I find myself watching are the ones where, yes, I like the main character, but there's an empathy or a sympathy for the villain in a way. He has to be defeated. He has to be beat. but there's an appeal, there's a draw to them, because you need the thrilling character. Because in a way, who gets to break more rules than anybody? The bad guy, the serial killer, the monster. Duh. I mean, and most people that come to horror want to be rule breakers. You know, I mean, you've heard the cliche joke about people, you know, if I did this stuff for real, from haunted house worker perspective, you know, they've said it, but it can apply to acting in a movie, being a director, being a screenwriter. I'd be in jail. You get to break the rules. You know, you don't take orders from anybody. You can go kick ass and make chaos, but at the same time, it's all pretend, and it's all in good fun. With that being said, we're talking about interruptants. And what I mean by that, when you imagine a Hot Wheels track, okay, there's 3 parts. You take away the middle, and one of the racetracks are flying in, and it's going to crash unless you put in that connector tube to get it to the other side. Well, it's kind of ironic that I call it the interruptant piece, but in a way it holds the story together, because the protagonist needs an obstacle to overcome. But it also makes the story cohesive and brings it in to the rest of the story. However, let's talk about a movie like Slacker. Slacker, to me, was a bunch of disconnected pieces, a bunch of story starters. They started a story with a guy or a girl, and they left. They left. They didn't give you a real protagonist. They didn't give you a real cohesive story. But if you look at the movie as well, what a movie has is the main protagonist, main antagonist, can be metaphysical or physical, and you follow them, and the other people are just there to supplement and hold up the good guy or bring conflict. Here you go to the sideline characters the whole time. There's little story starters. Now, if you'd have fleshed that out, found one of them, like, for example, the kid that wrote stories. But that was a novelist working on his JFK assassination. I forget how he said, but working on his JFK. He's talking in the library to the girl. He's like, yeah, you know me, I keep up with my JFK assassination conspiracies. And he's a novelist. Then you got the dude that comes from his dad's funeral, stepdad's. And he said, oh, no. He's, you know, the guy's giving him a ride to say, I'm sorry about your dad. And he's like, well, fuck, I'm not. I never thought he'd die. He smacked me and my mom around. Story starters. Everyone's got their own little story. But nothing was molded. Nothing was developed. You know, you look at Ted. Perfect example is the relationship between Mark Wahlberg, relationship between little Ted, and at that point he breaks up the little guy. You know, he's like, fuck, I'm too old for you. You know, I'm 30, I'm still smoking pot with Teddy fucking Bear. Does all that stuff. There's the emotional context. And the little douchebag, little chubby boy, and his weirdo dad dancing goofily to Tiffany. We don't like them. We don't want them anywhere in this fucking story. We'd rather they go, you know, molest each other, or whatever the fuck they do, torture animals. But they're the interruptant. They're the antagonist, and the interruptant is usually the antagonist. But to give it a depth, you need an interruptant. And if you don't have an interruptant, you don't have a real story. Because what I think of as an interruptant is you've got your characters developed, um, but you could also make your own little story off of that or continue that. You know what I mean? Without, because you've already developed your story. You've got something you don't want to happen. You've got something you're emotionally invested in. And then they change the stakes and they almost make another, they add another genre. You know what I mean? All of a sudden it's action. It's still comedy, but it's action all of a sudden. You know what I mean? Beginning starts off as kind of fairy tale, then it's a buddy comedy. Fairy tale by, Avery and the announcing of, well, you look at the typical formula of a buddy comedy. They like each other. Something breaks them apart. They come back towards the end. And what was the accelerant? This time it was the interruptant. He's like, oh shit, I still care for Ted. That's what you win. But you could go in a whole nother direction, leave them out, and still try to find a way. But then you've made it action, and you've added a depth to the character. Or not to the character, excuse me, to the story. Because one phrase that I've heard that I've dreaded, that I disagree with, and he was praising one of my stories, so it's cool. But then a creative writing professor, whenever him or anyone else would say, it was or it wasn't just a horror story. That's what he said he liked about my story, Smile. Which is fun, to think, well, there's another element. But at the same time, there's rarely just a horror story. I mean, you look at The Conjuring. It's about family. It's about love. It's about, as well as the spooky ghosts. With that being said, YouTube, thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Have yourselves a great